What kind of person would ride a bicycle 13,000 kilometers across deserts, war zones, and mountain passes just to climb Mount Everest alone, without oxygen, without a support team, and then pedal all the way home? That was Göran Kropp, the Swedish adventurer who refused to take the easy way. Facing brutal weather, crushing loneliness, and even the deadly 1996 Everest disaster, he set out to do the impossible, conquer the world's highest peak on his own terms. Göran Kropp wasn't born into fame or privilege. He grew up in Sweden in 1966, fascinated by the outdoors. But what set him apart was his obsession with hardship. While other kids dreamed of comfort, Kropp chased the opposite: struggle, pain, and the mental toughness that comes with it.
Jag har fått hundratals gånger. Hur kan man komma på idén att cykla från Sverige och ner till Mount Everest och klättra upp och så ta cykeln hem? Ja.
By his early 20s, he was already carving out a reputation in the climbing world. Between 1988 and 1992, he launched himself into expedition after expedition, tackling peaks most people had never heard of, like Mushtar Tower in Pakistan and Pik Pobeda on the border of Kyrgyzstan and China. These climbs weren't glamorous. They were brutal tests of endurance, each one sharpening his ability to suffer and keep going. And tragedy struck early. In 1992, while preparing for a climb on Cho Oyu, his close friend Mats Dahlin was killed in a rockfall in the Alps. Kropp could have walked away. Instead, he pushed forward, summiting the mountain and leaving his friend's ice axe at the peak in tribute. That moment defined him. Loss would not stop him. If anything, it hardened his resolve. By 1993, he had already achieved something extraordinary. He became the first Scandinavian to summit K2, the deadliest mountain on Earth. But for Kropp, even that wasn't enough. He was already dreaming of something bigger, something so extreme it sounded insane. By the mid-90s, Göran Kropp was already respected in the climbing world, but respect wasn't what he was chasing. He wanted to do something no one else had ever attempted. And in 1995, he revealed his plan, one so outrageous that even seasoned mountaineers thought he'd lost his mind. Instead of flying to Nepal, hiring a Sherpa team, and climbing Everest the conventional way, Kropp decided he would bike the entire way from Sweden to the Himalayas. Not a quick trip either. We're talking over 13,000 kilometers across Eastern Europe, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, and India before even seeing Everest. On his custom-built bicycle, he loaded 128 kilograms of food and gear, the weight of another person strapped to his frame. Every pedal stroke was a grind. He pushed through scorching deserts, freezing mountain passes, and endless border checkpoints, often questioned by officials who couldn't believe what he was doing. And remember, this was just the approach. Kropp's real goal wasn't the ride. Once he reached Nepal, he planned to climb Everest solo, with no bottled oxygen and no high-altitude porters. Just him, his gear, and the mountain. For most people, the idea of simply reaching Everest Base Camp is the dream of a lifetime. For Kropp, it was just the halfway point of his insane mission. He wasn't going to settle for just the climb. He was going to cycle to the mountain, conquer it on his own terms, and then, as if nothing had happened, cycle all the way back home. After half a year on the road, battered by storms, food shortages, and endless hours in the saddle, Göran Kropp finally rolled into Kathmandu. Most people would have collapsed from exhaustion, but for Kropp, this was only the end of the warm-up. From there, he loaded his body once again, this time with a 73-kilogram pack strapped to his back, and began the brutal trek toward Everest Base Camp. No porters, no yaks, no shortcuts. Just him dragging his own mountain of supplies step by agonizing step through the thin air of the Himalayas. At last, after thousands of kilometers and weeks of climbing, he stood in front of it, Mount Everest.
Fy fan, det är fantastiskt faktiskt.
The peak that had crushed the dreams of countless climbers. For a moment, he allowed himself to admire it. The ice-capped ridges, the terrifying scale, the sheer beauty of the world's highest point. He was exhausted, sunburnt, and broken down, but his eyes lit up. This was what all the suffering had been for. But Everest is never just a mountain, it's a living trap. And Kropp's timing couldn't have been worse. He had arrived in the spring of 1996, the season that would become infamous for one of the deadliest disasters in Everest history. What awaited him wasn't just the climb of his life, it was chaos, tragedy, and the thin line between survival and death. When Göran Kropp reached Everest Base Camp, the mountain was already buzzing with climbers from around the world. Dozens of expeditions had gathered, many of them packed with paying clients who relied on guides, Sherpas, and oxygen tanks to carry them to the top. But this wasn't a normal season. In May 1996, Everest unleashed one of the most devastating storms in mountaineering history.
Within days, 8 climbers were dead, caught high on the mountain in whiteout conditions, frozen in place with no chance of escape. Kropp witnessed the chaos unfold around him. Guides were lost, clients collapsed, and entire expeditions fell apart in the thin air. He described himself as completely exhausted, barely able to move a few meters without collapsing. His lips cracked, his hands numb, and frostbite creeping at the edges of his fingers and toes. The line between life and death was everywhere, sometimes marked only by a body in a blue bag along the trail. For Kropp, the warning signs couldn't have been clearer. Everest was sending a message: turn back or be next. Many climbers would have quit right then, and honestly, most people would have been smart to. But Kropp wasn't most people. He pulled back to recover, bided his time, and waited for the weather to clear. The disaster had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. And once the storm passed, he knew exactly what he had to do. Because for Göran Kropp, backing down wasn't an option. On May 23, 1996, after weeks of recovery and acclimatization, Göran Kropp made his move. Unlike the guided teams who had perished earlier that month, he was climbing completely alone. No oxygen tank to fall back on, no Sherpa to carry his gear. Just Kropp, his ice axe, and the endless wall of Everest above him. Every step higher felt like dragging a mountain on his back. At over 8,000 meters, the so-called death zone, the human body begins shutting down. Muscles starve for oxygen, the brain fogs, even the simplest movements feel impossible. Up there, exhaustion isn't just uncomfortable, it's fatal. But somehow he kept going. Through the wind, the blinding sun, and the dizzying thin air, Kropp pushed past every warning sign his body was screaming at him. Hours felt like days. The summit always seemed just out of reach. And then, against all odds, he made it. Göran Kropp stood on the roof of the world, completely solo, without bottled oxygen, without support. A feat so rare, so extreme, that even among Everest climbers it seemed impossible. But if climbing up was hard, getting down was worse. Kropp was nearly out of strength. His legs shook, his throat burned with thirst, and his body was on the verge of collapse. He stumbled his way back toward safety, each step a gamble with death. At times he admitted he could barely move 5 meters without stopping. Yet somehow he survived. He had done what few humans could even imagine, cycled from Sweden to Nepal, climbed Everest the hardest way possible, and lived to tell the tale. And for most people, that would have been the grand finale, the crowning achievement of a lifetime. But for Göran Kropp, it was only the beginning. Most climbers, after summiting Everest, are airlifted home or at least collapse into months of rest. But for Göran Kropp, the mountain wasn't the finish line. To him, Everest was only the halfway point. Once he descended safely and packed up his camp, Kropp did something that left even seasoned mountaineers shaking their heads. He climbed back onto his bicycle. The same bicycle that had carried him across continents, through deserts and war zones, was now waiting to take him all the way back to Sweden. Think about that for a moment.
He had just spent weeks in the death zone, nearly killed by exhaustion, frostbite, and dehydration, and instead of catching a flight home, he began pedaling thousands of kilometers through the punishing heat of India, across the Middle East, through Europe, and back to Scandinavia. When he finally rolled back into Stockholm, he had done what no one else had even dared to imagine. Cycled from Sweden to Everest, climbed it solo without oxygen, and cycled back again. It wasn't just a mountaineering achievement, it was a statement, a declaration that true adventure wasn't about shortcuts or comfort. It was about testing the absolute limits of what a human being could endure. And yet, incredibly, Kropp still wasn't finished. For most adventurers, conquering Everest the way Göran Kropp did would have been enough to last a lifetime. But Kropp wasn't wired like most people. For him, one impossible challenge only opened the door to the next. To Kropp, it wasn't about records or fame. It was about testing the very edges of human endurance. Again and again, he searched for ways to strip adventure down to its rawest form. No support teams, no easy routes, no compromises. Just him against nature, with nothing to fall back on but his own strength and willpower. Tragically, Kropp's life was cut short in 2002 during a climbing accident in Washington state. But even in death, his legacy lives on as one of the most hardcore adventurers the world has ever known. Not because of records or trophies, but because he refused to do anything the easy way. He proved that sometimes the hardest path is the one worth taking. See you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe.